This oral history of museum computing is provided by Aaron Straup Cope and was recorded on the 12th of February and the 29th of March 2021 by Paul Marty and Kathy Jones.
I mean, I guess there's two approaches to this. One is, war stories. And then the other is the sort of larger context in which all of this work happens. And I had occasion, I was talking to someone else in the sector recently, and what I was saying to him, it was interesting because it was a thing that I had been saying about museum collection data, but I think it applies to, the work that goes on in the technology sphere, which is fundamentally, and no one wants to hear this. I mean, it's a bit of a drag, but fundamentally the job is managing absence. That, and in the context of, museum collection data, you're like, look, it's all imperfect. We know this. No one wants to admit it. And a lot of museums go to a lot of trouble of, only presenting, the perfect record. And it's always about saving face. And the argument that I've had with people is, it's not going to take long before people realize the dirty little secret is that all museum metadata is garbage. I mean, in the aggregate. I mean, when, the way that people approach it and the concern that people have about it, you're like, well, if that's the case, then when we look at all of it, most of it is pretty bad. And what I was, we had this conversation a lot at Hewitt, and what I would try to say to people is understand that we have managed to accomplish some pretty remarkable stuff on the backs of all of this terrible data. So it's not de facto a reflection of you or your work. And in fact, the good news is that it can only get better. But, the same is true, I think. I mean, it's not a one-to-one sort of apples and oranges, but the same dynamic is true of the work that goes on in museums around technology, which is there's never enough time, there's never enough money, and there aren't enough people because there's never enough time and there's never enough money. And when there is money, it gets put into questionable resources for which there isn't enough time or money or people to sustain them properly. So you end up in this vicious circle of, in order to address short-term needs, you hire outside vendors who produce something that's very expensive, that isn't designed to be sustained, and that you don't have the staff to sustain. So nothing happens until the next round of funding when you hire another expensive vendor to do the same thing. And I think that, I've been thinking about this a lot, talking to people and just thinking about the sector in general, that this is in fact the world, this is the sky we live under, and this is the challenge. And what people don't want to think about, at least on bad days, is what do we need to do and change and accept in order to deal with it, that dynamic. That, and particularly when it comes to technology, and if you think about, and software, and sort of designing and building systems, we look to the private sector and we look to the commercial sector. And it's, honestly, it's a distraction. I did a talk a couple years ago where, I was saying Disney is to the museum sector what Google is to the technology sector, which is, it's not a useful comparison. Google and Disney both have created, their own universes. They breathe different oxygen than we do. And, they've done that by virtue of their hard work. But we can't do what they do because we don't have any of the infrastructure. And I think that same dynamic exists with a lot of sort of best practices in engineering, as a loose term, that it is predicated on staff and resources and budgets and salaries that we don't enjoy. We should, but we don't. And so I just, I've been trying to think about what are realistic expectations for projects? What are realistic expectations for handing projects off? What are realistic expectations for making these things sustainable, right? The other thing that we don't enjoy in the sector for a variety of reasons is we don't have a history of handing complicated projects off. I mean, I'm sure we could find examples, but they are the exception still, that something gets built and it runs and it works, but the people behind it leave, either because the salaries are terrible, because because there's the dynamics around senior exec and directors in museums. Basically we drive people away. We have a retention problem. And so all of the history around a project is lost. And new people come in, and in particular, you see this with complex systems. Some things are just complex. There's a lot of moving pieces because that's how you have to make something look simple. And people are overwhelmed. They're overwhelmed because it might be a brand new system to them. They're overwhelmed because they have ideas about what they want to do and they've inherited this other thing. They're overwhelmed because the director has new ideas about what needs to happen and there's this other thing. And because they don't have enough latitude, whether that's from the director or from the organization. They don't have enough latitude to figure things out. And so the only thing that they see is the opportunity for failure. And rather than the opportunity to, realistically address the organizational dynamics that have left this very complex system in a state where no one's entirely sure what it does. But the other thing I said in that talk is that when we make that sort of casual comparison, we do a disservice to the work that Disney and Google have done. I mean, they earned it, and they've invested a lot of money, and importantly, a lot of time. Which is the other thing that happens in the museum sector, which is, this happens in all organizations, but you see it in spades in the museum sector, which is, the belief that version 2 of any project will never happen. And the consequence of that is that, everyone's hopes and dreams and aspirations get front loaded into version 1, and the results are predictable. It doesn't really work very well. It's clunky. It takes a long time, all of those things. And my argument has always just been like, what if we just did version 2? Right? What if we just believed that we would actually do version 2? And, so talking about like stories in the work, like that's one of the things that, in my current role, at SFO Museum that I have actually tried to do, which is to say, we are going to launch bite-sized features around a specific topic or problem. And we're going to do that deliberately, one, because, time is limited and there's a million other things to do. but also as an exercise to make sure that we come back and do the next iteration, even if it's very small. And that's really just to start to collect a body of evidence that it can happen. And it's challenging because, you know, there isn't, you're not releasing things that necessarily warrant trumpets and fanfare. And that's the metric that we usually use for everything. And, you know, the truth is that a lot of times people don't want to, I mean, it's that tension between, you know, is talking shop the public face that you want to present? Like, people don't necessarily care about the larger meta issues. But there's a quote that I've sort of trotted around ever since I heard it, and it was from the designer Jack Schultz, who said, "No one cares what you do unless you think about it, and no one cares what you think unless you do it," which is a nice, I think, a nice sort of framing device. And the reason I'm talking about all this is, you know, going back to Disney and Google, is they have sort of multi-year projects. They have multi-year investigations. They obviously have things that they deliver, and they have things that people value and support and give them money for. But they also bet on the future in a way that the sector hasn't historically.
Let me jump in with one thing that you made me think about. Back in the 1990s, I remember talking to a lot of museum registrars who were very reluctant to put information about their collections online. And when I asked them why, they said, because our records aren't perfect. And I said, well, then you're never going to get anything online. How do you go from that mindset to, I think about some of the talks. I know I saw you and Seb give at least one talk at a Museums of Web conference about the amazing stuff you were doing at Cooper Hewitt, the collections API there. How do you go from that mindset to, hey, let's open our stuff up and see what people make?
So there's the strategic part about how you do that internally. And, you know, Seb did that before I got to Cooper Hewitt. So he may not like this characterization, but, you know, whatever. I mean, I think Seb, I mean, when we did the first metadata release, I don't think people necessarily realized what he was doing. And then it was just too late, like it was done. But the way that I used to talk about it is that, and I'm let me see how to construct this, because there's two pieces to it. The sort of backstory to this is that at a fairly fundamental level, museums have been very greedy of people's time and attention, that we want to control the narrative around the things that we collect and the things that we talk about. And, you know, whether or not that's good, bad, or indifferent, it also just doesn't really matter in a world where the internet exists. I mean, it's an approach that just got superseded by the present, like it's done. And what I would say about the collection at Cooper Hewitt, we ran the numbers, and we realized that we had about 10,000 objects where we didn't have a picture of it, we didn't know the title, we didn't know who it was by, we knew it was on exhibition at some point, we probably knew where it was in the shelves, but not always, and we knew it was a print. So basically what we had were 10,000 pieces of paper. And I was like, we could go down to Staples and buy 20 stacks of printer paper and it would be the same thing. But the idea was that we would give each one of those objects a stable, permanent URL. We would give it a home on the internet. And the idea being, and in particular the web, like that's an important thing I think that's gotten lost in the last few years, which is just how important the web as a philosophical and technical infrastructure is, and how closely it maps to the cultural heritage sector in terms of what it values and what it thinks is important. That we would give every one of those objects a place on the web that we were able to control, that we were able to say, this is here. This is not the thing, but you know, you may not be able to get into the stacks. You may not be able to come to DC or New York. Like the argument is that it's better than nothing. I mean, that's the core. That you know, yesterday people had literally nothing, and now today they have something. With the idea being that, you know, let's say there's an object that has, we don't have a picture of it, we don't know who made it, but we know the title, right? And you and I know what that object is. And so now that thing has a stable identifier in a, you know, globally connected network, and you and I can share that link. And the idea being that we start to add mass and weight to the object around which things can orbit. And it's not necessarily important what those things are, right? Like you and I might have an academic interest in something, in this object, but you know, my other friend and I might just think it's, you know, a piece of funny pop culture. Well, it's not important. It's that, you know, it's that the object itself is the transit for an intellectual endeavor. And then importantly, it's this, you know, going back to this idea of, you know, version 2 and version 3 and version 4 is one of the things that happened was, so we did the metadata release at Cooper Hewitt, and that was a few months before I got there. So it was done, right? The horse had left the barn. There was no putting it back. If you looked, you would see just how bad the data was. And then we put up all of the web pages. And you know, I can talk more about this if you want, but there's a whole other exercise around how you represent absence. Again, it's that question of managing absence. Like, what do you do to make pages and pages and pages of nothing a little more something? And at the time, we had digitized maybe 7 to 10% of the objects. So, you know, 20,000 out of 217,000 objects, give or take. And what happened was Seb ran the numbers and figured out that, and this, don't quote the numbers, they're placeholders. Basically, Seb figured out that to digitize an object in isolation was about $50 a pop. But to do them all at once, the unit cost dropped down to about $7. And Seb mentioned this in a board meeting one day, and the chair of the board basically turned around and was like, "Where's my checkbook?" Literally, I mean, that's what happened. And a year later, 70–80% of the remaining objects were online, and the rest were like coming down the pipeline rather, and we had done the whole thing in 2 years. And And the thing was that as soon as any object was digitized, it had a place to go on the internet already. It just, every object got a little bit better. Every object record online got a little bit better. And I don't think that the inverse would have happened. That if we had digitized 200,000 objects, the museum would have been like, now we're going to make a website for all of these things. I mean, it would have turned into the usual like 4-year, $700,000, fiasco. So that's how I talk about it. That's what I say to people, that, after Cooper Hewitt, I went back into the private sector rather, and I was working for a mapping startup. And I was responsible for a gazetteer of geographic places. And, it was an openly licensed gazetteer of all the places in the world, from continents down to neighborhoods. And, we were like, look, the world's a big place. This is an ambitious project. Not everything is perfect. And the de facto motto of the project became better than yesterday. That, like, and again, when the startup folded, and I used to say to people, I was like, yeah, so, this thing we've built, it still isn't perfect, but we can go back to we can just rewind to 2014 if you want. You guys can start from scratch all over, like, but maybe that's not what we do. And, I think a lot of this is, some of it is a rhetoric that tries to justify the operational realities of technology in the museum sector. That the money we spend on third-party vendors is unsustainable. I mean, it's gonna run out sooner or later. And, woulda, coulda, shoulda, that's money that would have been better spent on internal capacity. But the past is the past, so until we get there, we should keep endeavoring to spend that money on internal capacity. But until we get there, we have to be realistic about what we can accomplish and how, and what the metrics for success are.
How do you argue for building that institutional capacity when museum directors are so gung-ho to go out and hire those outside firms?
Or just to add to that, don't see the value in building that internal capacity.
Well, so I think what you have to be able to argue and demonstrate and convince people of is that digital is not a passing fad. That and so I did a paper last year for Museums on the Web that was a very long thread that started out with, one of the challenges we have is we, the sector, are unable to articulate clearly what we mean when we say digital or digital technologies. That there are, in fact, a number of equally valid but very, very different definitions. But we kind of use a catch-all. And so it's not surprising that when we try to get down to actually implementing anything, no one's quite sure what's going on anymore. So my argument has always been that when I say digital, I'm talking about something that's more expansive and more inclusive than not. And in particular, it depends on the idea of the internet, of a globally connected network. that it has changed people's expectations around what is possible and what is something that can be taken for granted. And so I've talked about this a lot as sort of either the operal, I'm not even going to say that because I'm having trouble saying it, but the de-fetishizing of recall. That we live in a world where, one of the things, people pull out their phone, touch the sky, so to speak, something happens, and then they put their phone away. That's genuinely novel, and it's genuinely awesome. It's great. When people would say to me at Cooper Hewitt, like, what are you trying to do with the collection website? Like, what do you want people to do? And what I said to them was, I want people to link to us. Because we're the National Design Museum. And, you would be forgiven for maybe thinking that was a little overstated. But, right now, in 2012 anyways, people link to Wikipedia. And again, Wikipedia's earned it. But we should do that. We should be so good that people link to us. So, this is still sort of, I'm still sort of turning this around in my mind because I'm not sure what it means, and I recognize that it's a little bit hoity-toity, but it's this idea that digital technologies in the cultural heritage sector are a kind of transformational mass in the same way that, education departments were transformational masses on museums and their collections. That, it's not that one is better than the other. I mean, notwithstanding the never-ending arguments between curatorial and education, now there's like this third thing. But it is the argument that it is one among equals, and it is a new thing. If you can't convince someone of that, then the rest of the arguments are sort of moot. And once you do convince people of that, then, it's the same sort of resourcing and the same allocation of attention and staff and, all the things that make things operational. We don't outsource conservation. Well, I'm sure some people do, but as a rule, you don't outsource conservation. You don't outsource curatorial, although increasingly that's happening. Just a quick backstory. Part of the reason that I wanted to go to SFO Museum is that we do literally everything except digital in-house. We do conservation, registration, curatorial, receiving, packaging, exhibition design, fabrication, installation. All of it's done by the museum staff, which is unheard of. And what I like about that is that, things happen slowly, things happen with a very small team, but there is that institutional capacity, so that it's never a question of like, how are we going to do something? And by extension, the other dynamic of always depending on someone else to get something done is that you start to foster a culture that necessitates third-party validation, right? Like some days, I don't want to, it's not to pick on curatorial, but some days you're like, you guys put together like lists of Excel spreadsheets and then you just throw it over the fence and you're like, you do something with it, make it pretty so that people show up. And it's not that there isn't outside expertise that can be brought to bear on this stuff, but at the same time, it's like, don't you have opinions? And that's a dynamic that you see sort of played out across a lot of the departments. And, you know, again, I mean, when you're talking about cultural history, when you're talking about cultural artifacts, you're talking about the past, you're talking about, you know, trying to piece it together in a story. I mean, there's two parts to it. One is history has always been lossy, right? We've always been, I mean, so going back to the notion of managing absence, you're like, well, that's sort of baked into the practice. So I don't know why, you know, digital technologies are treated differently, unless you think, not without judgment, but you think that their only function is marketing, is to serve as an attractor. If you do, then yeah, there's a totally different way of working. But the other thing I was thinking about was, you know, when you're thinking about the past and history, there's a lovely quote by the historian Margaret Macmillan, where she says, you know, the past keeps changing because we keep asking different questions of it. And, you know, with that in mind, you sort of think, well, if we're going to have tools and technologies, digital, network, whatever, then that should be the metric by which it's judged. Do the things that we create allow us to keep asking questions? I was looking over at, it was actually an old MW talk from, I guess, about 10 years ago, where I was saying that something to the effect of, it was about community and community participation. And I was like, you know, the good news is that there's a whole universe of people out there who want to help you. And then I said, the bad news is they're going to help you whether you want them to or not. That they're just going to self-organize. And, you know, I've often used Openstreetmap as an example. So Openstreetmap is often likened, it's not a perfect comparison, but it's likened to be the Wikimedia of maps, the Wikipedia of maps. And it's an astonishing project. They have achieved the impossible, which is to actually make an accurate map of the world, you know, using nothing but volunteer efforts. And the sad part about Openstreetmap is Openstreetmap was founded as a reaction to the licensing around the Ordnance Survey data in the United Kingdom, which is expensive and onerous. And Openstreetmap was just like, well, fine, we're just going to do it ourselves. But as such, Openstreetmap was founded, you know, essentially its founding was political. And the challenge has been, I don't know that Openstreetmap will ever find a way to hold hands with the Ordnance Survey, that it's always going to be in opposition to the Ordnance Survey. And that's a shame, because there's value in both projects. And I think there's this idea that if you let a multiplicity of opinions, if you let a multiplicity of, you know, degrees of seriousness into an institution or a project, that it will de facto undermine the very legitimate expertise that does exist, and that it assumes that by letting in all of these other voices, that no one will want to hear the experts. And I actually just don't believe that. I think people always want, like, sooner or later, someone's going to want someone who's thought a lot about this to be able to speak about it. But that shouldn't preclude, you know, for lack of a better term, that shouldn't preclude what is essentially fan fiction around the collection or the things that we have. I think a lot about, one of the people who's really good at this is Ellen Lupton. I mean, everyone loves to hear Ellen talk. She's amazing at what she does. She's super knowledgeable. She's a very good communicator. I don't think anyone would want Ellen to stop thinking or talking about this stuff. But there are other ways of, engaging and interpreting the collections that she's focused on. And it's okay. I've sort of lost the thread, so I'm gonna stop there.
No, that's okay. It seems like you're talking about democratizing what we're doing, and I think that's a really good way to go. There's room for everybody, right? So her opinion or her knowledge is there alongside other voices. Maybe an example, when I worked at the Peabody, when we could finally have tribal elders come and speak about the collections, it wasn't just the anthropologist voice anymore. It was somebody else. And even somebody else could come into that as well with another opinion. Does that
Yeah.
kind of fit, Aaron, with what you were saying?
Yeah, I mean, it does. I mean, as you were telling that story, it reminded me of, so it reminded me of the 9/11 museum, which is a whole bag of problematic for a bunch of reasons. But I remember thinking two things when I went to 9/11. One of the interactives they had was, just like a web-based kiosk for listing all the people who died. And there was there was their name and a short narrative about them. And I came away thinking, like, would that we could create something like that for all the different tragedies that, 9/11 occupies a very specific place in the United States, but, it's not a lot of people point out, they're like, so 3,000 people died, that was terrible, but ... And that's, there's some validity to that critique. And all of those other things that aren't 9/11 don't enjoy the same focus, the same, even just the same, I don't want to call it an archive. They don't enjoy any kind of weight or mass in the universe. They just kind of drift off, and they might be kept alive by, oral histories or like small pockets. But I think, what the technology of the present day, coupled with the mandate of cultural heritage institutions, allow is for us to start thinking about, well, what if we did start to keep some of that stuff? How do we do that? What does it mean? What are the opportunities that it presents? And so, at Cooper Hewitt, one of the things, so we had the pen and you could collect things, and that was all great. It was a lot of work, but sort of core to that was this idea that we would hold on to your visit. And, we would like you to come back in 24 hours, but it was okay if you didn't. It was okay if you didn't come back for 2 weeks or 2 months or 2 years. And so that was a very, very deliberate attempt to sort of bump up against this idea that museums are greedy of people's time, that we demand you always do things on our schedule. And my argument was like, we're the Smithsonian. All we do is keep stuff safe forever. So we can't apply the same degree of rigor around your visit that we do to accessioning objects. But maybe the infrastructure that we build for keeping your visits safe and just making them, giving you confidence that they'll be there in 2 years, maybe that can be training wheels for the Smithsonian to think about how it addresses all this other stuff. Because yeah, there's a lot of it. It's complicated. There are many issues, but you know, I mean, here we are, and this is our mandate, and you know, it's not unlike public broadcasting corporations who began life doing radio, you know, realizing like, oh, television is just another, it's just another broadcast channel, and the same for the internet. And yeah, I mean, my bias is towards the public. I mean, that's why I like to work in the public sector, because, you know, we have a mandate for you. I mean, I guess, yeah, I'll probably spend a lot of time thinking about this, but, you know, the question of like, how do you, I mean, how do you convince people of the merit of doing this? I tell the story a lot of, there was a Kickstarter project, a crowdfunding project a few years ago. There was a photographer who wanted to go out and document all of the rest areas across the United States that had all been built in the 50s and 60s. And her argument was, you know, when these were built, they all reflected very significant regional features and differences. And as those facilities are being largely privatized, they're becoming standardized. And so all of those unique characteristics are being lost. And so I'd like to go out and actually, you know, create a documentary record of this. And I always thought that was a good story because, you know, 50 years ago, when those rest areas were built, if you'd said like, it's really important that we document the bathrooms along the side of the road, people would have laughed at you. Fast forward 50 years and we now understand, you know, why. And we've seen this happen enough times. This isn't new. It's not necessarily the subject that is important. It is the rigor with which that subject is approached. And so maybe we can the value in collecting and publishing and sharing this stuff in all of its imperfections is that we are betting on a future where someone else will see, the forest for the trees, or vice versa. One of the things that we're doing at SFO Museum is we're just building systems to capture flight data. So all of the arrivals and all of the departures and the flight paths in and out of the airport, with, excuse me, all the airlines and the aircraft, and just all the things that are important to a museum with a focus on aviation. And we're just snapshotting it. And we're just publishing it every day. And in the next couple of weeks, we're going to do the same thing for the parking garages and for the checkpoints, the security checkpoints. And that's really boring data in the moment. It's really hard to see like why that's important. But I know from, just experience that sooner or later someone's going to be like, that thing with the stuff. And you're like, yeah, but no one has the stuff.
So I want to ask you a question about that. So what if we do have the foresight to collect it? So, now there's the active collecting movement where people are saying, be even more thoughtful, don't collect unless you need it or can use it. I get that. Can you leave like a little thought process into that data that you're collecting now of what you were thinking that it might be used for so that it won't be deaccessioned in the future? I'm just kind of making that up, but I think it's an interesting question.
So the short answer is yes. I mean, emphatically yes, that should be part of the process. We, in as much as, so I think I said at the beginning of all these interviews that I have made a practice about being sort of relentlessly open about all of this stuff. That a really, really important piece of the work for any team is to just write about it and to publish that writing. And so the easiest, cheapest way to do that is to just have a weblog. And this was a thing that we really tried to drive home at Cooper Hewitt. And eventually it just became part of the process. In the early days, we sort of had to shepherd people along to write stuff and to be like, it's okay, no one's going to judge you, like there's value in what you did. But there is now that historical record, and almost any time that people ask those of us who were there from 2012 to 2015 about something around what we did, there's a blog post where it talks not just practice, but also theory. And so that goes back to the sort of Jack Schultz quote. And I think that, so the question around what you should or shouldn't accession is it's a valid one. It's an ongoing one. And I think that there's not one, but there are different approaches depending on the medium or the media that you're trying to accession. And so particularly for, metadata or born digital records, I mean, it's just not a problem anymore. Disk space is so cheap. The Gazetteer project that I mentioned, it's called Who's on First. And one of the decisions we made early on is that the unit of currency for every given record is a plain text file. And so what you have are, this huge collection of nested directories with text files in them. And the argument being that if your concern is longevity, portability, and durability, nothing's better than a text file, just period. The next piece of that is that in 2021, we know how to batch process text files quickly and efficiently. We can put them in any old database you want. It's not a problem. It's an extra step, but it's manageable. And then, I know lots of people are celebrating the death of microfiche, but it will ride again. The argument that we never did this, I always wanted to, but I was like, we're gonna have 26 million records and we're gonna bake them to microfiche. And so the idea was, and I still wanna do this, I wanna do a round trip where we take a born digital record, we snapshot it to microfiche then we scan it, and then we do OCR on it, and it becomes machine readable data again. again, with the argument that's like, look, a book with 26 million pages or 100 million pages, that's a big book. Microfiche with 100 million pages is, a wall of boxes. But I think, we used to measure value and importance. We used to use the means of production as the measure for value and importance, that inclusion in a book represented something because producing a book was expensive and difficult and time-consuming and occupied literal mass in the universe. It's just not true with databases. I mean, we just don't worry. I mean, you just don't have the same problem. So I think, again, I'm like, the benefits of saving this stuff for the future and in believing that there is a future, in believing that there is version 2, and I know we're almost at time, so I'm gonna squeeze this in, because when I have talked about like version 1, version 2, the thing that I've pointed out is what I'm really trying to say here is that fundamentally most museums don't believe a person will come back a second time, and that everything about museums organizationally and by extension technologically is predicated on the idea that people will only come to your museum once. And it's not so funny anymore now that we're a year into a pandemic, but when I would tell this story, I used to say to people, I was like, just tell someone from MoMA that JFK is going to be closed for 2 weeks and just watch their face like it turns ashen. Now you're like, oh yeah, well, that was prescient. But, if we don't believe that anyone's going to come back to our institution a second or a third or a fourth time, that's kind of an existential crisis for the whole cultural heritage community, because cultural heritage is predicated on revisiting an idea. It is that, that Margaret Macmillan quote of asking different questions. Or we are just another entertainment option among many. And if we say that that's if we say that that's what our value is, then, Disney will slit our throat with a smile. We have said the rules of the game are what Disney does, and Disney will be like, cool, we're here to fill that void. It's a theme that keeps coming back, and I think a lot of it has to do with sort of so much of the cultural infrastructure around the arts and cultural heritage is focused on a particular class of users, if you'll excuse the expression, meaning scholars and experts, and that there is a whole universe of conventions that have been built up that are fine, like they've served that group well, but it suddenly when you introduce educators or the general public, there's no way in, because it depends on, if you'll excuse the shorthand, like it depends on having a PhD. It depends on having 10 years of learned practice of thinking and speaking about the subject in a particular way. And, I think that's, if, one of the other things that has come up, at least in the conversations that we've had, is the sort of never-ending split or divide between curatorial and education. And I think, if nothing else, the value of education sort of becoming coming into its own is forcing that issue, that there is another equally valid way of looking at, of thinking about, and of speaking about the work. But I don't think that anyone was quite ready for what that would mean when we opened up the doors to the general public. Yeah, I had occasion to look over an old paper that I had written. And stop me if we talked about this the last time, we might have, but I don't think so. And it was about, sort of at the core, it was about the galleries project at Flickr. And what I was trying, and it was, I presented it at museums on the web, and what I was trying to say was that, you know, if you look out on the internet, there is a whole lot of activity that, you know, looks that you know, maybe we don't want to call it capital C curating. I mean, it sort of took on the word got overused and abused. But what I was trying to say was that, you know, what you see is people exercising a curatorial muscle that, you know, they might not have ever talked about it that way, but that's really what's going on, right? It is the act of choosing. And the other point that I was trying to make was that the important thing to understand about what the internet and what digital makes possible is, you know, that there's a whole, like, outside the confines of the ivory tower, of the institution, of the expertise, there's a whole other party going on. Like, that's what the internet made possible, was that suddenly everyone realized, like, oh, we don't have to depend on the Met to do these things. You know, that whatever else you want to say about Tumblr, like, I think Tumblr more than anything as a product fostered that kind of behavior and that kind of skill. And I was trying to point out, I was like, look, we ignore this at our peril. Like, it doesn't have to be, it's not a threat. And I think actually, you know, we're kind of in a weird spot right now. Like, I'm a little, there's a rhetoric that's going on right now in the sector that I find problematic, and what I find problematic is that at the core, what it's saying is, you know, in the service of user-centered design, in the service of community, in the service of, you know, opening up the space to as many people as possible, fundamentally, our collections are nothing more than props. And it's, I mean, I can see I can intellectually, I can make a connection between that, and it's not invalid that the collections are devices for conversations. But at a certain point, if we're going to go down that road, why do we have, like, why are we keeping any of this stuff? And why do we have all of these buildings? And what is the function of, you know, depending on how you want to count, 300, 400, 500 to 1,000 years worth of practice? So I'm still trying to work through that, but it's just something that whenever I think about, like, people stretching a curatorial muscle and, like, and that ability to include more people, you know, I wonder if we're not swinging the pendulum a little bit too far. And again, I think you know, I touched on this at the very end of the last conversation, like, if we say that our collections are nothing more than props, that we are measured on that, then we put ourselves in a fairly precarious situation, because there's a lot of people who can do that better than we can. Like, really. And we sort of undermine. Yeah, I mean, I think it's, anyways, I think it's a conversation I would like to see happen, because one of the questions it raises is, maybe some of the stuff we have isn't actually worth keeping. I mean, anyways, yeah. Anyways, it opens up a lot of other conversations.
Well, it's akin to the conversations that we have in the public library sphere, right? People will come in and use the library as a community center to look for jobs, all kinds of activities that are only tangentially related to the actual collection of books, right?
Yeah.
But does that diminish the purpose of the library to provide public access to information? I don't think it does. I think it provides an additional role for the public library, which continues to make it an important community center. And I think the museums are going through a similar transformation here. Back in the day, we used to refer this as changing about thinking about the visitor in the life of the museum to the museum in the life of the visitor. What is the role that the museum plays in the lives of our visitors? How do they think about us? And we want them thinking about the museums when they're not physically in the museum, right?
Yeah, and go ahead. Sorry.
I would say, go ahead. No.
Well, I don't think that the Seattle Public Library was the first, but because they got the fancy Rem Koolhaus building, it was easy to point a finger and sort of say, this is kind of a revelation. And I remember the first time I went to the main branch in Seattle, and I was amazed. I was delighted. It was an amazing space. You wanted to spend time there. They had just sort of, it was little things like good seating and power in the floor, so that you could just go and work there and be in a space that you could be in a social space that had a public mandate that sort of took to heart the people who were in the building, whether they were looking for a job or just relaxing and it's always seemed to me that that's something museums could but won't do, that museums don't create spaces where people can come and make those collections just an ambient part of their lives. And that goes back to a comment that I've made the last time about, we being museums are exceptionally greedy of people's time and attention, that we want to dictate what the quote unquote experience is, rather than thinking about, again, it's sort of the same sort of thing. Like if you think about the top floor of the Seattle Public Library, which is basically just a big open space with chairs and electricity and the internet, what would that be but with collections? What would that be with rotating collections? What would that be if, what would that be if you said, we're going to do, I'm just thinking out loud, but we're going to do a half dozen works we're going to do a single artist over the course of a year, and we're going to do half a dozen works every month, right? So it's a manageable role turnover in terms of installation and deinstallation and all the rest of it. And there's obviously a lot of issues around conservation, security, all of it. But, I guess I sort of feel like that should be the work that we do. Like, yes, it's hard. We're here to do the hard things. And what if we had lots of those spaces? And what would it mean for people to think about, quote unquote, experiencing art in that way? And that continues to be the reason why I choose to work at a museum in an airport, because people don't think about it this way. They still think of it as a novelty, but it is kind of an amazing space to see art, because there is frankly, there's an enforced period to look at it. But, and again, a lot of this is predicated on, the before times. But if you imagine like business travelers or people who travel for work weekly, like that is an opportunity for prolonged, continued for a prolonged continued revisiting of specific works. And, you know, again, for me, I've always just that, like, when you sort of pull the thread all the way back to why we do this at all, why the humanities are important versus just like, you know, whatever's on Netflix this week. That at its core, it is that ability to revisit and reconsider a subject. And that is what physical museums are very bad at. And I think what the pandemic has demonstrated beyond a shadow of a doubt, like I think it's forced people to admit that we have manufactured the museum experience as a one-time tourist trap. It shouldn't be that way, but it is. And there is no expectation that anyone will come back, and the closest you will get to revisiting a subject is the postcard you buy on the way out of the door. And that's terrible. And it's also why the internet, in its broadest definition, is so important, because it may be an imperfect revisiting, it may be a flawed reconsideration, but it's better than nothing. And yeah, I mean, if the conversation is about, you know, the history of trying to go down that road, I mean, I think, I don't know if it was Sam or someone else, but that willingness to say that we will do something proactively and preemptively because we believe that that we should be ready when people's expectations change, is, I mean, without that, there's nothing. I mean, you can't argue for the funding, you can't argue for the staff. And, you know, I think if the question is like, what have we learned? And this is, you know, this is an unpopular opinion because it's pretty critical, is what we've learned is we went 2 steps forward in arguing that we should be proactive and preemptive. And then we took 1 step backward, because when we tried to do it, we squandered all the goodwill and all the money. There isn't really, like, I know I touched on this before, and it's not to point fingers at any one group or institution. It's to say that we need to be honest that collectively, our efforts over the course of about a decade, maybe 15 years, haven't, or rather didn't, amount to very much. And so it calls into question the value of being preemptive. Personally, I think there's still value in that proactivity. I'm not even sure that's a real word, but whatever. But I think, you know, in addition to arguing for, you know, staff and funding going forward, we need to be able to argue. We need to be able to justify we need to be able to admit that there were mistakes made, and that we will do better, that we can and should do better going forward. Because I think, you know, you saw that happen, like, from, I don't know. I mean, you know, when I talked to Seb about this, he sort of dates it to somewhere between 2012 to 2014. It's not really sure. But let's just say 2012, until March of 2020, you just saw all of that effort, like you just saw all of that money and all of those efforts dry up. And then suddenly there was nothing but the internet. And no one really knew what to do. Still, people are not quite sure what to do or even how. I mean, there's lots of talk, but talk is cheap. At least for the foreseeable future, for as long as the private sector continues to be as lucrative and as comfortable as it is for people who can do the brass tacks of technology work, we will always be at a disadvantage because we can't compete on compensation. We can't compete on selfish compensation, I think is maybe a better way to put it. The work is better. The work is arguably more important and more rewarding. And so one of the things that I've sort of just, I don't necessarily know how the details will play out, but at a high level, what it boils down to is we are in for 5, maybe 10 years of just training our own staff, that we need to bring in essentially, we need to bring in mom and dad to oversee very, very junior engineering teams and to give them enough. We need to figure out how to make them, we need to build the capacity ourselves, is what it boils down to. And we need to figure out how to give people enough rope to learn and grow, but not hang themselves and not destroy all of, not destroy the museum's collection website, for example. And that's going to be a long process. And, when I think about it, I think that what you would need to say to those people is, some of you will cut your chops at this museum, and you will look over to the private sector and we'll never see you again. You will learn enough to get a better paying job in the private sector, and that's okay. Some of you will learn enough to get a job in the private sector and will come back, and we will welcome you with open arms, because you will then have had the experience in the private sector, and that will be valuable to what we do. Some of you will learn your chops in a junior role at this museum and go on to a senior role at another museum. And that is the best possible solution. That is the best outcome. That is what we want to happen. That we want you to do that and to replicate your experience here, there. And some of you will be, will be in this, some of you will be lifers. And that will be great, because you will be the institutional knowledge, and you will be there for the next group of people to come in. And over time, we will develop a practice that is centered on the cultural heritage sector, that that is better able to conceptualize and build tools to be able to understand the separations of concerns between an individual institution and the broader sector. And again, this is very much brass tacks. This is not high level stuff, but getting into the weeds of like, what are we going to do? We're very bad at that. We have spent 20, arguably 30 years building aircraft carriers that no one knows how to run. And we sort of split the middle between doing it ourselves and giving it all to the private sector. And, we rely on the Mellon Foundation to run these things. And this is not to, I don't want to dismiss the work that someone like ArtStore has done. But the fact that ArtStore has to have its own technical staff that no one else understands, and they just, all they understand is their username and password, is not, I mean, I guess you would be forgiven 15 years ago for thinking that maybe it was sustainable. You could argue it, like, sure. But I think we've seen, like, it's not. It doesn't really work. It doesn't really accommodate people's needs. And again, like, everything I've just said about, building and nurturing teams and doing the hard work of like managing junior staff, both managing the staff and then managing management, who's like, what's going on in there? Like, it's a pit of cats. They're all just running around crazy. And you're like, it's going to be like this for the first year or two. All of that is exceptionally hard work. And to that I say three things. One is yes. Two, we're here to do the hard things. And three, this is where the larger, well-funded institutions can and should play a role. That it should be organizations like the Met and the Smithsonian and arguably some of the British institutions are already doing this in limited fashion. But like the British Library, the V&A, people don't normally think about the Wellcome, but the Wellcome is doing amazing work at the moment. But again, like, I don't, if there was a critique of that, it's that that it's still focused very much on the immediate needs of the institution, and that there isn't this sort of broader understanding of and I mean, those larger institutions would probably push back and be like, look, we're just busy trying to run our enormous museums. Why should it be our responsibility? And I think the answer is, certainly for like the Met, you raised $20 million in an evening by letting people come and like prance around and touch the Temple of Dender. So yeah, maybe, like, I'm just saying, like, maybe you do have a little bit of a moral responsibility if you want to continue to argue the mantle of cultural heritage. So I think that is the core of the problem. And that's the thing that we need to solve. And I think I would stress that what I'm suggesting is not necessarily the correct solution. It's that in the absence of anyone else, if so far the only arguments or the only alternatives I've heard are giving up and raising more money from donors to hire third-party services. And I'm like, well, yes, giving up is an option. Let's just start from there. We'll say giving up is always a possibility, but we can always fall back on that. Like, no one needs to plan for giving up. It's there when we need it. But then the question is like, okay, what else? And everyone from the big institutions down to the small institutions has the same challenge, when it comes to staffing and retention. And the argument that I'm trying to make is that the larger institutions are better situated to deal with that problem than anyone else, and that it is in everyone's interest to develop, that, I don't like the phrase talent pool, but just for the sake of brevity, I'll use it. That is then there for everyone to be able to build on, right? Like the ideal solution, the ideal scenario is that, in 10 years, someone who cuts their chops at a small museum ends up going to the larger institution and then does the amazing thing that everyone loves. I mean, the work is, it's not about any specific project. It is about everyone being able to do those projects. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier about we need to not dance around our mistakes. We need to stop trying to find some justification for them. We need to just be upfront and be like, yep, we didn't succeed there. And one of the things that I want us to stop doing is just talking about possibilities. Like, talk is cheap. It really, like, we can talk all day long. And it doesn't really get us anywhere. And I think we need to, the work going forward. And again, this is really just about what's next, not about before. We need to be, we need to talk about things that actually accomplish something, even if they're tiny. And we need to celebrate tiny accomplishments. Not as that we need to celebrate them so that we understand that, you build a wall brick by brick. And, if you want to abuse the metaphors, like, even if you have a concrete wall, you lay rebar first. I mean, the thing that I always come back to is fundamentally, it's not that digital introduced new dynamics into the cultural heritage organizations in terms of, fundamentally, like, who's allowed to speak on behalf of the organization and what is the public face. It's that digital forced those issues in a way that nothing else had before. So they were always sort of simmering, and then suddenly they just, like, there was no holding it back. And, really what it boils down to is, if you think about, the web or social media, that anyone can hit the publish button. And that is that introduced suddenly there were no more controls. All the controls that organizationally had been depended on to sort of rein things in were no longer there. And I think, this goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning around, the expectation around the discourse, the boundaries around the discourse. And, one of the things that I haven't talked about this a lot at conferences, but I guess in the years leading up to 2012, one of the things, because I was still in the private sector then, one of the things that I would, when I would go to MW or MCN, one of the things that I would try to say to people is, I say this with love, but you need to understand that people like outside the hula hoop have no idea what you're saying. Like they hear the words, but they don't hear any meaning. It's just gibberish. And, sure, there may be like a sincere and serious professional discourse going on, but you're the only ones that understand it. And that's a very real risk. And so then suddenly, things like the internet happened, and there was a way to talk about the subject matter differently. And, in 2013, I did a talk at MW, and this was right around the time that we were, we had spun up the alpha website for the collection at Cooper Hewitt, and we were very big on experimental features. And we were very big on making the site as welcoming and even playful as we could. And I remember saying to people like, it's a bit weird for me because what I hear a lot of people saying is that we, being the Cooper Hewitt, are getting away with stuff. We are getting away with being playful, which, if the sentence is you're getting away with being playful, like there's a problem. I'm just saying, because, replace playful with welcoming, and you're like, what's the problem with that? And we were trying to think about how to make the collection approachable. And there were some practical reasons for that. One of them is, the decorative arts are, can be a little intimidating by just the sheer volume of the stuff. Like 100,000 fabric swatches, you're like, I don't even know where do I begin? And then on top of that, at the time, we didn't have accurate metadata, and we didn't have imagery for most of the stuff. So we had to find some way to make the collection approachable, some way to give people, the proverbial like feeling the shape of the elephant. And that I think this is where the dynamics haven't, I'm trying not to, I want to say senior executive, I want to say curatorial, and I'm trying not. The rest of the museum, the rest of an organization and the rest of the sector hasn't quite gotten there yet. And I think a lot of that has to do, frankly, I think a lot of that has to do with the realities of how the sector is funded and how we act as a service for letting other people save face, and how we save face in order to secure funding. That we present a certain, what we do is a proxy for other people's aspirations, that we are the experts, that we give value, we assign value to things, and that there's a very elaborate dance around the presentation of those artifacts and that meaning. That whatever you want to say going forward, historically has been very lucrative. It is how we have paid for these, I don't know if we have time to get into the funding issue, but like we spend money in all the wrong places, but we have gotten all that money by doing things this way. And it's very, I think the rest, so this is where senior executive, the directors, need to, the work needs to change. The work needs to be to say to those people, that what we're doing to broaden the reach of the collection is not a threat, that we are not making it less serious, that we are not undermining the credibility of the object, that there is a way to allow a multiplicity of voices and a multiplicity of interpretations that don't, I keep saying undermine, and I want to find a better word, but I think it's possible for an institution to have a direction, to have a voice, and at the same time to have a number of parallel conversations that question that narrative, that maybe go off in different directions, but where the museum can still say, like, this is where we're going, this is what's important to us, and it's okay if someone on staff is challenging that.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go.
Well, I was just going to say this connects to, in my mind, to the Smithsonian strategic plan that they announced a few years back to reach 1 billion people a year. Right? I don't know if you've read their strategic plan for, I guess it was a 5-year plan and they announced it in about 2018. So it's coming along. I don't know how close they are, but you don't reach 1 billion people a year in DC, right? This is an explicit acknowledgement that they're trying to have the Smithsonian be a force in people's lives, no matter where they are in the world. And
well, I mean, the Smithsonian is an interesting example. I mean, I have argued for about 5 years now that, the Smithsonian should just, the argument that I made was the Smithsonian could fill every large and medium-sized airport in this country. And there are, most of them are tiny, but there are about 4,000 of those. And I still use second person plural. I still say we. The Smithsonian could fill every one of those airports with collection objects and not take anything down off the walls in DC. And still have stuff to spare. And I'm just like, look, if you want to reach people, like, there you go. I mean, but I think one of the things that's maybe lost in a lot of these conversations, and I think really needs to be remembered. And I touched on this with that whole argument about, like, our collections aren't, people seem to be making the argument that our collections aren't important. Is we need to figure out a way to do all of these things, to reach all of these people, to allow a multiplicity of interpretations. But we need to do so in a way that actually says, you know what, we do have expertise, we do have experience with this stuff, and we do have an opinion. And the opinion is valuable, that the curators, for all of their professional quirks, are actually good at their job. And we benefit from that. And that it's not, it's not a celebrity death match. That, I think what I worry about the current discourse is that it's a kind of well-meaning scorched earth policy. And I don't actually, I just can't, I can understand it emotionally, but when I step back and think about it, I'm like, yeah, that's a terrible idea. That, like, these people have done amazing work. Like, this is, we do it. Like, it's a little hard to understand. And that's definitely an area that we, for improvement. But I don't, I don't know that we benefit from just saying like, it was all a terrible mistake. And I think we need to find some way for people to recognize each other's contributions. There's a Canadian filmmaker whose name is Nadine Labaki. I can't remember the exact pronunciation. Anyways, she is of Lebanese origin, which is relevant only because I was listening to an interview with her, and the subject of religion came up, and I don't remember exactly what the question was, but her response is something that's always stuck with me. And what she said was, it's not so much that we are intolerant of each other's religion, so much as we are intolerant of each other's rituals. And that has always seemed to me to be a good and important articulation of the problem, that we don't recognize the ways that other people celebrate things, and that we are threatened by them when perhaps it's unnecessary. And I would say that should be the work going forward. And that, the onus is on, excuse me, the onus is on everybody. Because I guess I think two things. I mean, in this push to do away with any kind of authority figure, or someone who is charged with expertise. I think, those things just evolve naturally in any community. There is a legitimate and larger philosophical and political conversation around that, about whether there are ways of organizing communities that haven't been allowed to exist, that maybe would challenge some of those ideas. But we also have a hard stop in 5 minutes, so I'm going to kind of gloss over those. Yeah, I think I'm just repeating myself. I mean, I think there's room for everyone. Sorry, go ahead.
The point I was going to say, your points are coming out really, really clear. I would reflect back on something you said earlier about the museum being a single visit tourist trap.
Yep.
I'm not even sure if we can count on everybody agreeing that that's a bad thing. But I think a lot of our work is trying to not have that happen, right? But I was thinking about, I guess it was 2018 or so, I was giving a talk in Doha. It was my first time ever there. Fascinating city. And of course, since I probably may never go back, who knows, right? I went to go see the Museum of Islamic Art designed by I.M. Pei. Absolutely gorgeous place, right? Clearly one of those one-time visit tourist trap museums, right? You walk through the whole thing, it's beautiful, it's gorgeous, but the works of art, it was like walking through a jewelry store. There was no context, there was no content. Where was the research? Where was the curatorial voice? It was, where was the connection to our shared humanity, right? It was just stuff because it was pretty. And you leave that thinking, okay, that was nice, it was beautiful, it was gorgeous, but what difference does it make to my life? And I think so much of the potential of what we do in museum computing enables us to help people draw those connections to our shared humanity, for them to be able to see this thing, right, connects me to these people, like you're talking about religious rituals, right? This connection between all people. There's room for all of those voices in there somehow.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, you know, there are some things that digital makes possible that are that you know, you just can't do physically, and that's great. Like, but beyond that, you know, in the short term, it is digital is that way to sort of bridge the realities of economics and geography, where, you know, you might not be able to go back to the museum in Doha every week. I think one of the things that's sort of interesting about the times we live in is, you know, we are living through a sort of aggravated moment of signs and signifiers where, and I don't think most people talk about it this way, but I do think it's what's going on where, and the craziest part is, you know, that at the core of signs and signifiers is like a constant revisiting. Like, these symbols have like a very deep rooted meaning. Like, there is I'll repeat myself, but there's like a very deep consideration of them. But they are given voice in sort of one-offs, you know, things on plinths and galleries that are shiny. But they come to signify like a much, much broader conversation. And what's interesting to me is that I think it's happening in a very real way, and I don't think anyone's talking about it. I mean, and not to say that people don't think it's happening. It's, everyone knows it is, but no one has like a discourse. It's just, and you know, we'll give the museum its ice cream its 2 minutes due, because that's about what it deserves. But like, into that, you have, you know, the Museum of Color, the Museum of Ice Cream, like these things that are basically designed to just do that. Like, but again, I think like if that's the vehicle that we choose for, that we think is appropriate for the humanities, for the larger practice, then we might be in trouble, because we are, I mean, we'll just be eaten alive.